eyes and laid aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections. The result of all our counsel may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace, and tranquility of the island, and the united and knitting together of all hearts, of persons and estate within the same, in true Christian love and charity one towards another. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Be seated, please. This Honourable House now resume its sitting. Call of the roll.
Mr. Witter, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clark, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Darrell Voss, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Malahoo Ford, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Green, Mr. Terrelong, Mr. Main, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Mr. Holness.
Right here.
Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown-Burke, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Dayton Campbell, Mr. Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Montague, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Mr. Bunting,
Statements by ministers. Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following: the Financial Administration and Audit Contingencies Fund Resolution 2019 under the Financial Administration and Audit Act. The report of the I don't have a resolution. Oh, sorry. The report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee on its deliberations on the Third Supplementary Estimates of Expenditure for the financial year ending 31st March 2019. The Financial Administration and Audit Contingencies Fund Resolution 2019 under the Financial Administration and Audit Act.
Members, before we proceed, I wish to bring to your attention a matter of public concern. Although not a member of Parliament, we have lost a friend. Doreen Samuel died a few minutes ago, and she has been a friend of parliamentarians and Jamaica as a whole. I think it's appropriate for me, on behalf of the Parliament, to send condolences to her friends, families, and colleagues. Our colleague also lost his wife, and since they work well together, we could just add to that. You will recognize that I have not called his name. Mrs. Cook, you can remind me. Alan Magnus. So, on behalf of the parliamentary, we send condolences to the family, and we'll miss her and miss them both off the air. Any further announcements?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, on the item of announcement, I'm seeing here absent the tabling of the Integrity Commission report on the sale of the UDC property in Ocho Rios. A colleague of ours in the other chamber raised it, and I gathered from the report that the House would see to it that the matter was attended to. I was hoping that at this sitting we would see a tabling here. I would be guided by you, Mr. Speaker, on the matter of it. But, Mr. Speaker, it is for reasons very germane to my own constituency that I have special interest in this matter, because that report, and based on some earlier report during the period 2 years ago by the then Contractor General regarding the valuation, the whole sale of the property, I too have a situation at Bernard Lodge where parcels, huge parcels of lands have been transferred, sold, where the valuations to those properties are unknown and raises a lot of questions. And one thing is in common, is the same minister involved with that UDC transaction is the same minister involved with the Bernard Lodge land transfer in Portmore. So, Mr. Speaker, I will be very much be guided by you in terms of when the report will be tabled so it can shed some light as to what has transpired.
Mr. Jackson, in order not to stimulate a discussion on a matter that is not before us properly, either as a resolution or in the right order, I will take note of what you said and we will answer you in the right, at the proper time.
Should I interpret that, Mr. Speaker, that you will obtain when it will be tabled? Otherwise, we'll be waiting indefinitely.
Mr. Jackson, we will speak to you at a later stage in the game. Any further announcement? If not, bills brought from the Senate.
The following is a message from the President of the Senate to the Honorable House of Representatives. I have the honor to advise the Honorable House of Representatives that on the 22nd day of March 2019, a bill entitled An Act to Apply a Sum out of the Consolidated Fund to the service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2020 and to appropriate the sums granted in this session of Parliament was passed in the Senate without amendment. Signed, Thomas Tavares Vinson, President of the Senate.
Petitions, papers, reports from committees.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay on the table of the House a copy of the report of the Public Administrations and Appropriations Committee of the House of Representatives on its deliberations on the Third Supplementary Estimates of Expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2019.
Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the items notices of motion given orally be recommitted.
Mr. Leader, can you tell us what you have to state what you want? The motion is that we recommit notice of motion given orally. Those in favor? Those against? Dr. McNeil.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Be it resolved that the report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee of the House of Representatives on its deliberations on the Third Supplementary Estimates of Expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2019, which was laid on the table of the House on the 26th day of March 2019, be adopted. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for suspension of standing orders to enable me to take the motion.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the National Contracts Commission Validation and Indemnity Act of 2019. And Mr. Speaker, I also beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I'll move the following motion. The Financial Administration and Audit Act. The Financial Administration and Audit Act Contingencies Resolution 2019. Whereas Section 13 of the Financial Administration and Audit Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, provides, pursuant to Section 118 of the Constitution of Jamaica, for the establishment of a contingencies fund which shall consist of issues from the Consolidated Fund Principal Bank Account not exceeding in aggregate $100 million or such greater sum as the House of Representatives may by resolution approve to defray unforeseen expenditures, and whereas it is desirable that the maximum sum that may be issued as aforesaid be increased to $10 billion. Now, therefore, be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. This resolution may be cited as the Financial Administration and Audit Contingencies Fund Resolution 2019. And 2, the Contingencies Fund established by Section 13 of the Act shall consist of issues from the Consolidated Fund Principal Bank Account not exceeding in the aggregate $10 billion. And Section 13 of the Act shall be read and construed accordingly. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business. Mr. Semuda, public business.
I ask that the meeting of the House be suspended in order.
Members, when we are in the House to do business, we have to do business. Everybody's chatting their own business, and when we go through the item, we have to go into motions to recommit. And I'm not going to do that. Unless it is absolutely necessary and was not carried here. I'm being asked to recommit questions.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the item questions and answers to questions be recommitted.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Questions and answers to questions.
Mr. Speaker, at the expiration of 21 days, I wish to ask the Prime Minister the question standing in my name.
Public business.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the meeting of the House be suspended. But why don't you take it?
You have to tell me. Yeah. You're in charge of public business. Mr. Speaker, I now move for suspension of standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notes of motion, of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? I love it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the PAAC met this morning to look at the third supplementary estimates. It was quite straightforward, nothing controversial in it. I think it's just some housekeeping to carry to the end of the financial year, which is 5 days away. So it was really just some shuffling, but no main changes. But, Mr. Speaker, just two issues that were pointed out, which just for the information of Parliament. One of the items in the supplementary was the payment of 2.1 billion for streetlights. Committee feels it's a good move. We're in the process of paying off or paying down with the intention of paying off the debt to JPS. So your committee has asked that the clerk get in touch with the Ministry of Local Government and coordinate with the Ministry of Finance, because there was a timetable given where the street lights that weren't working. There was a commitment, I think, that they were to have been all repaired by June or July of this year. And at the same time, we were also supposed to have that process of the LED lights being put in place, which was the basis of the agreement made to pay down JPS. So your committee simply asks that we could just get the report, see if we are on track. And that once we get that report, we will also table it in Parliament, because I think all members of Parliament are interested, because it is a topical issue when you go out. Everybody is pointing out the street lights that aren't working and those issues. So your committee asks for the report, and we'll get it from Ministry of Local Government, and just keep the House abreast of that. The second item which arose had to do with the disaster emergency contingency fund, which had 500 million, and an additional 1.5 has been put in. I think it's a good move to have the fund, to build on the fund. However, from a year before last, when we had, I think 2017, we had some floods, and there was great concern because we also contribute to the Caribbean Catastrophe Fund. And the problem with that is that we found that we've been contributing for many years, and we never seem to be able to meet the criteria. Exactly. In other words, it appears as if we would need complete annihilation to actually get something out of the fund. So a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago, we had asked the Ministry of Finance to give us a report on the catastrophe fund, to tell us how much we have spent over the period of time, what are the criteria. We were hearing today that one of the criteria is how close the eye of a hurricane passes to the island. But I think it's important for us to have a debate, because what we're looking at is the different levels of response to disaster. We understand that the Ministry of Finance or the government is looking at a disaster report, a disaster program, and so we have asked that the report that we requested 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, to deal with the catastrophe fund, if we can look at it, and the committee analyze it with the help of the information from the Ministry of Finance. And then again, we will pass it on to Parliament for Parliament to take a look at it, because I think it's something that we really have to look at. Those were the two issues that arose from the deliberations today. Other than that, the report speaks for itself, so I ask for approval of the report by the House.
Mr. Speaker, just one small but important item that came up in the committee this morning. Part of the recurrent transfer is to cover the wage settlements in the public sector. And in fact, we're told that 90% of the public sector wage settlements have been made. In that 3%, Mr. Speaker, usually it's the smaller groups. And unfortunately, the fact that it's still outstanding means that they remain unsettled. And those are usually the persons who earn at the lower end of the income scale. So I just really want to use the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister, to see how we can settle those. Though it's out 3%, but it's a set of vulnerable public sector workers. Just this morning, I encountered one such worker, and when the lady conveyed her wage level, I felt very uncomfortable about it. But it is not one of the big groups like the police and the nurses and the teachers and so on that we all try to settle first, and so they get left behind. So I just want to appeal to the Minister, if we could just tidy up and complete those which are outstanding, so that those set of workers don't feel neglected or just left in the rush.
So, Mr. Speaker, that concludes the debate. I ask that the motion be approved.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, I now move for a suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it. Doctor.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, the resolution before us seeks to raise the ceiling of the contingencies fund from 100 million Jamaican dollars to $10 billion. The contingencies fund is provided for in our Constitution, I believe section 118 of the Constitution, if I'm not mistaken. And it was first mentioned or just enacted or given life through the Financial Administration and Audit Act, which was originally passed several decades ago. In 1992, which is 27 years ago, almost 3 decades ago, the ceiling was raised to $100 million and has not changed since that time. Under our fiscal responsibility framework, we are required to transfer amounts to the contingencies fund. And this will be the first year under the third supplementary, since that requirement came into place, that we'll actually be doing so. To do so in any meaningful way would necessarily mean that the ceiling has to be raised. Because today, the contingencies fund has about 94 million and a ceiling of 100, meaning space of 6. We are proposing, Mr. Speaker, that the ceiling be raised to $10 billion. The incidents of natural disasters in Jamaica are such that, and if we could, an orderly is around, are such that we have frequent instances of disasters that inflict damage in the region of 2% of GDP, 1.8% of GDP. I have a chart here from the World Bank that shows, in 2012 we had Hurricane Sandy, which was about 0.5 point of GDP. In 2010 we had Nicole, which was 1.9%. In 2008, Gustav was 2%. In 2007, Dean was 2.6%, and so forth. So even the ceiling of 10 billion, which approximates 0.5 point of GDP, would not be sufficient to cover any one of these. But this represents just one layer, a layer of fiscal savings to which we hope to add other layers. Now, Mr. Speaker, raising the ceiling is just one step. We need to, and we intend to, and I'll say this in the supplementary contribution, to amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act in consultation with all stakeholders, including the opposition, to prescribe the circumstances in which funds can be drawn from this contingencies fund, which is provided for in our Constitution, provided for in FAA Act, and which the fiscal responsibility framework requires us to accumulate savings in. We want to specify the circumstances under which funds can be drawn for use only in the event of natural disaster. The fact, Mr. Speaker, that we are making this increase doesn't mean that the ceiling will stay at this level indefinitely. We envisage a Jamaica where we will have opportunity to raise the ceiling again as our circumstances evolve, in light of the nature of the risks that we face. I therefore, Mr. Speaker, hope that colleagues will agree in the raising of the ceiling for the contingencies fund from $100 million to $10 billion, which will facilitate the third supplementary estimates or the implementation of them, where we are planning to make a transfer for the first time of $2 billion to the contingencies fund, specifically for use in natural disasters. I might want to remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that those who are affected by natural disasters tend to be disproportionately those who are from the vulnerable sections of society, socially and economically vulnerable. And this blanket that we're providing will be for their benefit and indeed for the benefit of all Jamaica. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the idea of increasing the limit or the cap on the statutory contingency fund established under Section 13 of the Financial Administration and Audit Act and authorized to be established in that manner by Section 118 of the Constitution is something that we certainly support. The idea of the country, as fiscal space opens up, establishing, as it were, domestic reserves to deal with the vicissitudes of life. We are in a part of the world that is unfortunately subject to a variety of natural disasters. And in the past, we have had to address those as they arise as best we can by rejigging the current year's budget, which is often negatively impacted in the sense that other expenditures have to be deferred to enable disaster relief and rehabilitation of vital infrastructure assets and so on to take place. So establishing a reserve funded out of the budget in a discrete account within the Bank of Jamaica is, I think, a step in the right direction, which we endorse. And in a sense, we have our net international reserves, and which have been certified as being adequate for a floating rate foreign exchange system. And now we are, in a sense, fulfilling what was always envisaged to be the case, that there ought to be a sum of money set aside when we have the wherewithal to do it, so as to address these types of calamities. Having said that, I have a very real concern around the governance arrangements to support this particular fund. It's one thing when it's $95 million, as it is currently. We are funding it out of this year's budget, now with this supplementary amount, to the tune of $2 billion. And the limit is being set at $10 billion. That limit doesn't mean there's $10 billion in the fund. That means that it can't exceed $10 billion. If we get it to $10 billion, it would have to be further increased by Parliament at that time to allow it to go further. And the Minister has indicated that's what he would like to see happen, and so certainly so would I. But as it becomes a substantial amount of cash, the arrangements in Section 13 of the FAA as to how that cash is used become very inadequate, because essentially what Section 13 provides is that the Minister responsible for finance, where the services provided for and funded in the budget become inadequate because of unforeseen events, can authorize advances to be made out of that fund. There's no need for any particular disclosure around that. It is true that subsequently provision has to be made in a supplementary budget to replace those monies, but there's no particular time frame for doing that. And the purposes for which the funds can be used is extremely wide. And as we approach the ending of a political cycle, oppositions necessarily look at the potentialities of these things in a very cautious way. But the bigger point really is that large pots of cash are set aside to protect the society. They must be used to protect the society and not for any other purpose. And the Minister, in his opening, said this is really for natural disasters. And I will take that as a sort of solemn undertaking on his part, that pending the amendment of the Act, which is in the TES, will follow in due course, and we look forward to that. He will ensure that those funds are only used if that type of contingency arises. And with that undertaking given, I'm happy to support this motion on the understanding that the necessary amendments to the FAA to provide an appropriate and robust governance framework for this will be brought into effect in due course. And in due course means within the coming fiscal year. You know, if we continue to be able to allocate resources to this fund over time, who knows, we may want at some point be able to treat it as a sovereign wealth fund and invest it to earn good returns and to help stimulate the economy, always being mindful of the need for liquidity and ensuring that we have the wherewithal to meet foreseeable, but not hoped for, but foreseeable risks if they eventualize. And that is something that's a vision that we would certainly endorse. I noticed the data that you referred to, Minister, about the impact, the economic impact of fairly recent natural disasters. My understanding is not that, and you could perhaps clarify this for me when you close, because I didn't get a copy of the document, because the orderlies, but essentially I understand is that what those numbers, whether it be 0.5% of GDP or 1.8% or whatever, were essentially the kind of estimated economic impact of the particular event, rather than the cost to the budget of that event. And therefore, having resources which may not be, will not be at this point anywhere near 1.8% of GDP, nevertheless, having cash that can address the immediate dislocation of a disaster, that will have a multiplier effect in terms of reducing the negative economic impact of that disaster as well. So in a sense, you don't necessarily have to have a dollar for dollar coverage of the estimated loss to the economy in terms of GDP terms, because if you can spend the money wisely and you have enough to do the fixes, you may in fact have that impact from much lesser expenditures. So we support this and thank the Minister for the undertaking given, and we look forward to playing a cooperative role in finalizing the design of the governance arrangements for this growing, hopefully, and important contingency fund. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, thank the member for the support of the resolution and for his contribution to the debate. As I said in my opening remarks or opening contribution on the debate, the Financial Administration and Audit Act, as it is written now, provides for drawdown of funds in the contingency by the Minister of Finance in his discretion. The purpose of this increase and of the allocation, the second supplementary of $2 billion to the contingencies fund, is to comply with the requirements of the fiscal responsibility framework, which requires the government to set aside funds for weather-related events on an annual basis. And we're fulfilling that requirement. Now, we intend to go further to ensure that whether this administration or future administrations can only draw down on the natural disaster allocations in the contingencies fund only in the event of natural disasters and only after some assurance that all efforts have been made to use existing budgetary resources to address the expenditure requirements in the event of a natural disaster. Mr. Speaker, this represents a step forward for Jamaica in our overall risk management, and I look forward to working with stakeholders, and in particular the opposition, on the updates to the Financial Administration Audit Act to ensure that what is intended is indeed what occurs. The opposition spoke, the member, the vision that we have for this is that we start with the $2 billion today, and in subsequent years we can add additional amounts. And indeed, this can represent, this is a wealth fund for Jamaicans that if we manage properly and we are able to manage our economy properly, additional fiscal savings can in time accumulate to make this a substantial sum. I should add that under the existing provisions of the Financial Administration and Audit Act, these funds are held in the Bank of Jamaica and are managed by the Accountant General, which is an existing plank in our fiscal framework, which should provide a great degree of confidence. The member spoke to the economic cost versus recovery expenditure. And yes, the economic cost of a disaster may be 100 billion or 20 billion or so forth. But what we are particularly interested in are the set of expenditures that are called emergency expenditures. Those expenditures that you cannot delay. You have to address right away. The roof has blown off of the hospital, or the bridge, or something has gone wrong with certain access points or access roads. And generally, the literature suggests that there's a relationship between those emergency expenditures and the overall economic costs. And that relationship could be, in the region of between 20 and 30%. And what we want to ensure is that with the full measure of products that we have from our budgetary resources or fiscal savings or credit contingent facilities, our CRIF facility, and any other to come, such as a catastrophe bond, we have access to the emergency resources that are required even in the event of a Category 5 event. That is the aim, and that's where we want to be, and it is within sight. And I hope for the cooperation of everyone in this House when we table the policy on managing the financial risk of natural disasters to make this a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ask that it be approved.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the motion be approved.
Favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
I ask that the meeting of the House be suspended to enable the Standing Finance Committee to meet. You don't need a table. All right, then in that case, Mr. Speaker, I ask for notices of motion to be recommitted.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Dr. Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will remove, be it resolved that the third supplementary estimates of expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2019, which was laid on the table of the House on the 20th day of March 2019, be referred to the Standing Finance Committee of the whole House of Representatives, consisting of all members of the House for consideration and report. And be it further resolved that the committee, during its deliberations, take into account the recommendations contained in the report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee of the House of Representatives on its deliberation on the third supplementary estimates of expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2019, which was laid on the table of the House on the 26th day of March 2019. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion. Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion of which notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the motion be approved, i.e. the motion for the estimates to be referred to the Standing Finance Committee of the House.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
I ask that the House be suspended for the Standing Finance Committee to meet to consider the third supplementary estimates of expenditure.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. The Standing Finance Committee of the House of Representatives, consisting of all its members, the members of the House, is now convened. We'll ask the Deputy Speaker, Mr. Witter, to lead us to the throne of grace.
Let's pray. Father, as we come together to deliberate on matters concerning the Finance Committee and by extension the country and our parliament. We ask that you give us guidance. We ask that whatever we may discuss here today may be to the benefit of our nation. These and other mercies we ask in your name. Amen.
Members, you have remembered that last Wednesday, the House of Representatives by resolution referred to the third supplementary estimate of expenditure for the financial year ending the 31st of March 2019 to the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee for the House of Representatives for consideration and report. The committee's report, along with the third supplementary estimates of expenditure, are now before us for consideration. The committee is now ready to start the deliberation. I now ask the leader of our government business to inform us as to how we will proceed. Mr. Samuda. We have a difficulty here today. Even prior member didn't know we were praying. We are just asking you to advise us as to how we are going to proceed. The committee is now ready for deliberation.
Mr. Speaker, it was by consensus. We agreed that we would not need to disrupt the smooth flowing of the Parliament, and we would not have to introduce this table that is customary. And so it was decided by mutual consent that the Minister of Finance would address the questions from his seat. So I see no obstacle there, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the third supplementary estimates are before us, and I now ask that they be approved on this.
Just one question, and I wasn't at the PAC. In relation to the street lighting, the additional expenditure to take it to 9 billion or thereabouts for the fiscal year, from I think it was around 7 it had reached in the last supplementary. Where does that leave us in terms of our central government or local government indebtedness to JPS for the provision of electricity? Is there more owing, or has it been fully cleared now, or what?
Yeah, that's something I wanted to say. I will still do it in my speech. But I have a letter here dated March 4th, 2019, which specifies or itemizes what we owe the JPS for streetlights. The 2.1 billion will clear what we owe in arrears. So after today, we will have no arrears for street lighting to the Jamaica Public Service Company.
Mr. Paul.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. And going back to the clearing of those arrears, it was customary for JPSCO, because of these arrears, not to settle their bill with Petrojam. And so I'd like to inquire what arrears are still owing by JPSCO to Petrojam, and also, as we're on the subject of streetlights, if perhaps the minister could apprise us, because we are supposed to be moving towards changing out all the lamps to LED. Some have been changed. We were promised some savings, significant savings, and it should be done ratably as you change out the lamps. So by now, your bill to JPS should be going down and down and down. So we need to know if that is happening. Also, what is the rate of change? Because I know it was scheduled for a certain period of time for 100% of the lamps to move to LED. And thirdly, do we now have an inventory of street lights, because I continue to get complaints all over the country, including the corporate area, lights not working, MP, our lights not working. And I believe by now it should be easier to fix them, because JPS will earn more when they are fixed if we are monitoring that that charge accurately. So I think those are some important matters which arise out of settling our debt that we probably could not before now be very forceful about, but we ought to, now that the arrears have been cleared.
Thank you, member. By paying off our streetlight arrears with the JPS, it puts the government of Jamaica in a very strong position with the JPS scope in respect of the provision of the service. I don't think we've been in this position to be current with JPS in a very, very, very long time. Yes, let's just leave it at that. With respect to the first question that you asked, I have the written assurance of JPS that the full amount of these proceeds will be used to reduce their overdue balance to Petrojam. Okay, so this 2.1 billion is going from central government to JPS. JPS has an overdue balance. JPS has an overdue balance with Petrojam, and the expectation, based on the correspondence I've had with the CEO of JPS, is that the full amount will be used to reduce that balance even further. It was reduced from the prior payments and will be reduced even further. And now we'll be in a position where we, as far as local government is concerned, local government does not, which is the largest portion of the JPS bill, we have no overdue balances. With respect to the timetable that I would have outlaid in September, at a later date we can, the minister responsible can provide an update on where we are with that program. But my expectation, and on your third question, if I were to use what's in front of me here, then it would suggest that the bills are coming down, because I'm seeing a current amount of 262, which is less than the 300 that would be every month. So allow me to dig deeper, but on the face of it, the current bill seems less than what we have been used to as the average monthly bill.
Minister, in response to the member, yes, there is a significant reduction in the monthly bill. The bill was close to 320. It is now down to 260 something. Yeah, million. Yeah, down to 200 million, 60 odd. Yeah. At the previous Standing Finance Committee, when we did approve the first amount, a commitment was given to provide Parliament with an update. Yeah, and we're going to. No, just the last Standing Finance. 1 year ago, I could not have spoken in this way because we weren't anywhere close to that kind of agreement with the JPS. And the question my neighbor asked about it or not, we know exactly. Yes, we do. We are in a much better position now to say the lights that are working and the lights that are not working, and the areas where lights have been installed. So when I speak in the sectoral debate, I will be giving an update and also hopefully tabling the detail from JPS on repairs of streetlights. Yeah, man, certainly.
Yes, Minister.
Can I just ask a question before?
As a woman, I'll always yield. I mean.
Thank you, member. Minister, my question though is whether or not JPS has the capacity to, effectively carry out these repairs within a reasonable time, because in terms of the teams they have, take a place. Don't look at urban Jamaica. Just look at rural Jamaica. And when you look at the parish of Westmoreland, for example, when there is a power outage.
Mr. Buchanan, if you were addressing the chairman, we would have advised you. Could you advise us as to where of this you're speaking on? What is it that you're speaking on? Are you addressing the matter before us? You certainly aren't.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry you didn't hear me acknowledge you, then go to the minister.
No. Mr. Buchanan, if you were addressing the speaker, we would have replied to you to advise you, but you weren't.
I did address you, Mr. Chair, but...
and a matter that is not before us yet.
But...
Minister...
But Minister, but Chairman, my question isn't complete. Yes, Minister. I was saying that when there's repairs to be carried out, even emergency work, you will hear that the team is in Grange Hill, and they may be responding to emergencies all the way in Pisgah, Berkshire, on the border of St. Elizabeth and Westmoreland. And you have to wait on that team to drive all across to have the emergency dealt with. So I'm saying, with the amount of lights to be repaired, if JPS is going to employ private contractors or they're going to use their own team, because if they're using their own teams, 10 years from now, half the street lights not working won't be repaired.
Member, I can't speak about the inner workings. I can't speak about the inner workings. If you ask a question, I'm answering, member. I can't speak about the inner workings of the JPS. Well, you don't want an answer to the question. I can't speak about the inner workings of the JPS, but one thing I can tell you, based on the survey that we have done, JPS is living up to the commitment. They have given us specific time, and they have not surpassed the time. As a matter of fact, based on the last report that we have gotten, they are well ahead of what they said that they would be able to do up to this point. So I can't speak about what happened on the inside. I can only speak about what we know and based on the assessments that we have been doing.
Mr. Chairman, on the same matter regarding the payment for the street lights, and following up also on a question that was asked by the member from East Kingston and Port Royal, and I'm not sure if it was actually answered, which was really about the inventory, whether or not we do have an inventory of the posts. I wanted to go a little further than just the inventory, because the inventory is what we have today and what we have as working lights today. I wanted to know if we had a way of determining the lights that are out tomorrow. So if we have an inventory today that says that X number of lights are working, it doesn't mean that that same number is working tomorrow nor the day before, nor the day after. And that has always been a concern in terms of what we are paying for, and whether or not it's value for money, and we're able to identify the ones that are out, because in fact, the JPS is not any worse off collecting the bill when X number of lights are out, and it doesn't matter whether that number goes up or goes down. So I wanted to know where we are with that, because I believe that it's important. One, for the safety of our citizens, but two, for the value for money, and also in terms of accountability.
It is going to be difficult to say fully in terms of the working lights. But one thing I do know that the new lights that are installed based on the system, it tells the JPS, the new ones, when those lights are down. So there is, in fact, a method that exists that speaks to the smart street lights. Now, the remaining portion, member, you would appreciate that it is going to be difficult to be spot on in terms of the numbers. But the last estimate that was done, and based on the assessment that was done during the 2 programs that we put on for the Youth Summer Employment Program, estimate that about 105,000 streetlights are actually exist. And a rough calculation of that put it at about 99,000 that are genuinely working streetlights. So there is a ballpark figure that we are working with. So that whole infrastructure and information exists. It might not be precise down to the last letter, but it is a guide, much better. We are in a much better position now to speak to streetlights than we were up to a couple of years ago.
Can I just a quick follow-up? I know that there was also a contention between the government and the JPS in terms of when we're looking at the number of existing streetlights. Part of the problem being that there were some streetlights that were not approved and that had just gone up. Is it that in the rationalization we have accepted all the lights that are up as being part of the working system of lights and therefore part of what we're paying for? And you would understand, Minister, that I ask because I believe it is an open secret in Jamaica that a lot of the illegal lights are not done by persons who are strangers to JPS.
Well, the JPS by right ought not to. And I don't know if the JPS would have installed lights without the approval of the Ministry of Local Government, because we are the only ones that can grant approval for that. But one thing I do know, member, is that we have been working closely with the JPS. Right. We've been working closely with the JPS on that score, okay?
Minister, to you, Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead.
Minister, in answer to a previous question, you acknowledge a reduction being experienced already. My understanding is that we, as taxpayers, we are expecting a further reduction when the LNG, the alternative energies, both solar and LNG, kicks in. Is that your understanding, and are you able to say what sort of magnitude of reduction we're looking at?
Well, remember, the program to deal with the entire country is going to be over a 2-year period. So we are expecting to see significant savings in the cost to the country for streetlights. So, you know, they are a good portion into the change out. So, you know, we would probably wait a little bit longer to make a clear assessment in order to say exactly how much, because it's going to be difficult now to say what the savings is going to be. But one thing I can say, as the Minister of Finance did say, that we are seeing a reduction so far.
And that's expected to come not only from the technology, the changing technology, but from the alternative sources. Because
it is an entire system of smart streetlights that will be installed right across the country. That will be more energy sufficient and cost saving.
Mr. Chairman, Minister, part of the problem that the Ministry of Local Government had was the inability to pay on time to JPS because the funds were not coming in from the property taxes and so on. I know that there was an adjustment in the property tax rates. Are you now in a better position to maintain the the payments for JPS?
I'll ask the Minister of Finance to answer that one.
Thank you. Remember, having made this effort to bring our accounts for streetlights with the JPS up to date, we are not going to make it go back into arrears again. We're not going back there. So for the foreseeable future, what will happen is that we are going to be paying those streetlight bills from central government to ensure that they get paid and paid on time. Not necessarily, property taxes are being used for other activities of local government, which are also essential. But we are elevating the importance of streetlight. We believe it's important for security and safety in vulnerable communities. And as part of the government's thrust to try and improve security, especially in vulnerable communities, we want to make sure that this bill is paid and paid on time. So it will be done from the Ministry of Finance directly, and we will keep this current.
There's a follow-up, sir. Just a follow-up. I know the property tax is dedicated fund, a dedicated fund to the local government. Are you saying that you will pay? Allow me, sir. Allow me. Are you saying that you will pay the JPS bill, and then what is left goes to local government?
No. We're saying that from central government, from the consolidated fund, we will pay the streetlight bill for the foreseeable future.
Chairman, just a query, Minister. Your project 9513, the one that speaks to the comprehensive development of bushfire warning for effective bushfire management. I notice you have stepped down the allocation by $10 million. Bearing in mind that bushfires create such great havoc on the lives of the small people in this country, especially those in agriculture, all over the island. I mean, the Blue Mountain people suffered greatly from it. Those in St. Elizabeth and the Plains and all in Clarendon, we suffered greatly from it. But I notice you have downgraded the allocation. What would have informed that?
Thank you, Member. We have 5 days left in the financial year. So what you see here represents the reallocation of expenditure that was earmarked for particular purposes where those have not been fully spent. So rather than have the year expire and the funds not be used, we are redirecting those funds. And I think you would agree that we are redirecting them for good purposes, primarily towards the streetlight arrears and towards funding the contingencies fund.
Chairman, that would indicate, because there was not time to expend and to complete the project within this financial year. Are you saying that adequate provision is made to continue that work? Because we are very concerned in rural Jamaica about that particular issue. And the country should, because it's part of the economic growth development that will be stymied if it is not addressed.
But, I mean, as you know, Member, funds that are not used in a particular fiscal year cannot be carried over. There's a budget provided for in the next fiscal year. So it's just good fiscal practice to do some housekeeping, which is what we're doing now, identifying the areas where expenditure has lagged, and to make sure that we redeploy and use those resources effectively. And that's what we're trying to do. It does not in any way indicate any change of priorities with budgeted items.
I move. I so move.
sorry. The amendment to the third supplementary estimate. You ask that it be approved.
Minister, wait, the minister's supposed to say that.
Mr. Speaker, not me to do it. I ask that the third supplementary estimates,
those in favor,
the amendments be put to the House for approval.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put the third supplementary estimate as amended. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. The report of the third supplementary estimate of expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2019, with the amendments to be incorporated, is before us. Is this the wish of the committee for me to sign this report? Those in favor? Those against? As of it.
You're doing live.
Hey.
You don't have to go through that.
I'm going to give you a password.
Mr. Buchanan, this place was very quiet when you were on holiday.
Standing Finance Committee now adjourned Senate.
What do we do now?
Adjourned, sir. Adjourned Senate.
This committee is now adjourned sine die.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the items, reports from committees, and notices of motion given orally be recommitted to allow the Minister of Finance and the Public Service to table and have approved the report of the Standing Finance Committee.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay on the table of the House a copy of the report of the Standing Finance Committee of the whole House of Representatives, consisting of all members of the House, on the third supplementary estimates of expenditure for the financial year ended March 31st, 2019.
Notices of motion given orally. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I'll move the following motion. Be it resolved that the report of the Standing Finance Committee of the whole House of Representatives, consisting of all members of the House, on the third supplementary estimates of expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2019, which was laid on the table of the House on the 26th day of March 2019, be adopted. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today I'll move for suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion. Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the third supplementary estimates for 2018-19 reflect total government expenditure of $802.56 billion, comprised of $516.89 billion of non-debt expenditure, of which recurrent is $446.3 and capital is $70.57, and public debt service of $285.67 billion. Mr. Speaker, the revised estimates for 2018-19 indicates there's no deviation between expenditure outturns projected in the second supplementary estimates for approved in January and the third supplementary estimates which are before us now. The third supplementary estimate represents a reallocation of expenditure from areas where allocation has been made and those monies have not yet been spent with 5 days to go. While maintaining the expected expenditure outturn for 2018-19, the third supplementary estimate facilitates the reallocation of fiscal space to certain areas of the budget where execution at February 2019 indicated much slower than program implementation. The areas benefiting from the reallocated fiscal space, Mr. Speaker, are as follows. For local authorities in respect of street lighting, $2.1 billion to clear the remaining balance on the arrears as of March 2019, which follows a payment by central government of $7.2 billion provided in the first supplementary estimates. And this allocation will bring the total payout for the financial year to $9.3 billion, Mr. Speaker. And based on this letter that I have dated the 4th of March from the JPS, after this $2.1 billion, the government of Jamaica will not have any arrears whatsoever with respect to street lights to the JPS. Mr. Speaker, $577 million to complete arrears to supplies of goods and services, thereby putting for tax administration Jamaica, thereby putting the agency in a position to clear substantial arrears going into the next financial year. Mr. Speaker, contingency for natural disaster, we're making an allocation of $1.5 billion within the capital estimates that are being transferred to the contingency for natural disaster / infrastructure rehabilitation provision under head 20,000A in the Ministry of Finance and Public Service to $2 billion, up from $500 million, which was initially approved. The increased provision, Mr. Speaker, is to be transferred to the Contingencies Fund established under Section 13 of the Financial Administration and Audit Act and held by the Accountant General in the Bank of Jamaica. This is in keeping with the provision of the FAA Act, Fiscal Responsibility Framework, and the third schedule thereof, which requires the government to make budgetary provision to weather-related risk in the estimates of expenditure and to transfer the sum so provided to the Contingencies Fund. Mr. Speaker, the FAA Act was enacted 5 or 6 decades ago and provided for the Contingencies Fund. And the aggregate ceiling of that fund was raised to $100 million in 1992, nearly 3 decades ago, 27 years to be precise. Today, the Contingencies Fund has a balance of $94 million. Mr. Speaker, this will be the first time that the allocation is being transferred to the Contingencies Fund specifically for natural disaster risk in compliance with existing legislation. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica's economic independence is threatened by our vulnerability to natural disaster. We're therefore breaking new ground by making this transfer of $2 billion to the contingency fund. And I want to make a distinction. When the budget is passed each year, there's a line item for contingencies for natural disaster. Invariably, what happens is it gets spent on some repairs during the year, or it gets reallocated at the end of the year to some other ministry, department, and agency, and we never actually complete that cash transfer to the contingency fund. So in this year, we're doing a cash transfer to the contingency fund held by the Accountant General or managed by the Accountant General in the Bank of Jamaica. We intend to supplement this amount with further transfers in future years in accordance with the Financial Administration and Audit Act. The contingency fund will be available to Jamaica in times of natural disaster and will be an important layer in our financing of natural disaster risk. In my 2019-20 budget presentation, Mr. Speaker, I outlined the intention of the government to develop a policy for the public financial management for natural disaster risk consisting of several layers, including catastrophe bond at the top layer, contingent credit instruments, traditional insurance products like the CRIF, fiscal savings in a contingency fund, and of course the annual budget. Our history has been one where unplanned weather-related recovery expenditures has consistently diverted scarce resources away from social and economic development priorities, and invariably vulnerable communities are the most affected from the natural disasters themselves, but also from the diversion of planned expenditure. Financial planning and fiscal savings for the possibility of natural disaster, Mr. Speaker, is therefore not only consistent with our goal of economic independence, it also provides a much-needed safety net, in particular for vulnerable communities in times of natural disaster. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, the Contingencies Fund is held in the Bank of Jamaica, managed by the Accountant General, and lodgements to that fund can only consist of monies transferred from the Consolidated Fund principal bank account by way of warrants issued against a provision in the estimates of expenditure after the warrants have been validated by the Auditor General, and hence the need to come here today. Mr. Speaker, the government will work with stakeholders, including the opposition, to amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act to further specify the circumstances in which these fiscal savings can be drawn for natural disaster recovery. The intention, Mr. Speaker, is that these hard-earned fiscal savings being transferred to the Contingencies Fund are for use only in the event of natural disaster. Section 118 of the Constitution and Section 13, subsection 1 of the Financial Administration and Audit Act, FAA, as I've been saying, gives the minister responsible for finance the authority to make advances from the Contingencies Fund to meet unforeseen expenditure for which there's no budgetary provision or where inadequate provision has been made in the Appropriation Act, if he is satisfied that there is an unforeseen need for the expenditure or for which no provision or no sufficient expenditure has been made by an appropriation law. However, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in the debate on the increase in the ceiling of the Contingencies Fund, the intention and the action will be that this $2 billion that we're transferring to this contingency fund, as far as this administration is concerned, will only be used in the event of natural disaster, and that is after exhausting budgetary resources. And we will work with opposition to ensure that as far as future administrations are concerned, they too abide by the same principle. Mr. Speaker, the FAA Act previously placed a ceiling of $100 million as the aggregate sum, but this House, by way of resolution, has increased that to $10 billion. The Financial Administration Audit Act Contingencies Fund resolution was tabled this afternoon for approval by the House and lifted the ceiling, as I mentioned, to $10 billion, which facilitates the transfer of $2 billion as envisioned in the Third Supplementary to the Bank of Jamaica to be managed by the Accountant General. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I'd like to thank the chairman of the PAAC, the members of the PAAC on both sides of the House, and indeed members of the House for facilitating the tabling and the speedy passing, the consideration and passing of these third supplementary estimates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Golden.
Mr. Speaker, I don't intend to say much. What we already said on the resolution to recalibrate the ceiling to $10 billion and what was said in the Standing Finance Committee in the discussion around street lighting are really the more critical issues addressed in the supplementary estimates table today. We've had a good discussion on where we need to go in relation to the FAA provisions around the contingency fund to ensure a robust governance framework that will prevent those funds being used for purposes other than to protect the country from the losses to GDP, to infrastructure, and dislocation to people's lives that can result from natural disasters. We are on board with that, and we look forward to playing our role in ensuring that an appropriate design comes into legislation to make the FAA fit for purpose in that regard. At this point, I would just say this is the last sitting for the fiscal year, and again, we are pleased that Jamaica has reached the point where we can complete our budgetary arrangements within the fiscal year so that we start the new fiscal year, April 1, with an approved budget for that year and with all of the tidying up relating to the current fiscal year having been done. This is something that's taken a great deal of work. Successive administrations have committed a lot of energy to achieving this. The officials in particular who have to carry the burden of the technical work to make sure it's done are to be commended. And we want to continue as we have been so far, because it is showing a certain maturity in our public financial affairs, which is where we need to be in this our 57th year as an independent country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the opposition spokesperson for his remarks, and I have nothing further to add, Mr. Speaker. I would ask that the third supplementary estimates be put to the House for approval.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's not intended to do any further business. So I move that this Honourable House be adjourned for a date to be fixed. On the return to Parliament, I know that I can count on their lamentations as to the fact that they are no longer as strong as they were when we were taking the leave. But that is to come. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask you to adjourn this Honourable House.
Mr. Speaker, on the motion for adjournment, I'll just remind you that you had indicated that I'll hear further from you before we rise on the Contractor General's report.
The motion is?
No, let me repeat. Apparently, I meant
Mr. Jackson, you're a senior parliamentarian, and you want to bring a motion on the adjournment. You want to speak on the adjournment?
No, Mr. Speaker. With all seriousness, Mr. Speaker, in my comment,
I did promise you.
No, you had indicated, Mr. Speaker, at the time when we were dealing with notice that I would hear from you before we rise. I was only reminding you.
I did not know you needed to hear here. Okay. The clerk has advised me that she will examine the matter and an appropriate response will be given to you at the next sitting of the House. The motion is that this House be adjourned for a date to be fixed. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Members, please stay where you are until the mace leaves the House. It is important that members of the House respect the order of the House. This House now stands adjourned.
Start your day with some encouragement from New York Times best-selling author and practical Bible teacher Joyce Meyer.
God is not mad if we've not arrived. He's just happy that you're here today wanting to learn more.
You'll be refreshed and strengthened as you hear powerful messages of hope and transformation.
God, I want you to lead me and guide me, and I'm going to do what you want me to do. I don't care what it costs.